Tonight on the Midnight Drive, we're stepping inside the psychiatric institutions that helped make lobotomy feel reasonable. Long hallways, fluorescent lights humming through the night, overcrowded wards filled with people society no longer understood how to help. This episode is not about ghosts, but it may explain why abandoned psychiatric hospitals will unsettle people so profoundly. Because behind locked doors in institutional paperwork were real human beings experiencing grief, trauma, psychosis, depression, fear, exhaustion, and emotional collapse, while medicine struggled to keep up. And somewhere along the way, care began drifting toward containment, toward sedation, toward quietness, and toward control. Because when systems become overwhelmed enough, compassion itself can start getting replaced by efficiency. There's a certain kind of silence that only exists inside institutions. It's not a peaceful silence, it's a structured silence, the kind created by routines, schedules, locked doors, medication carts rolling slowly through the long fluorescent hallways. And during the early and mid-20th century, psychiatric hospitals across America became filled with that kind of silence. Not because nobody was suffering, but because suffering itself had become institutionalized. That's important to understand when we talk about lobotomy, because lobotomy did not emerge in isolation. It emerged from a larger system struggling under enormous pressure. Psychiatric institutions during this era were often overwhelmed beyond capacity. Some hospitals housed thousands of patients at once. Wards overflowed. Staff burned out. Resources stretched thin, and many doctors genuinely had no idea how to effectively treat severe mental illness with the medical knowledge that was available to them at the time. The uncertainty created emotional exhaustion on every level imaginable. Families, nurses, physicians, caregivers, patients themselves. And once the systems become exhausted enough, their priorities start to change. At first, the goal is healing, and then stability, then manageability. There's that word again. Been talking about it all week. That word manage shows up everywhere. And eventually, containment. That progression is one of the most unsettling patterns buried inside institutional history. Not because institutions are inherently evil, but because systems under pressure naturally drift toward efficiency, especially when dealing with large populations of emotionally distressed people. Mental illness itself carried enormous stigma during that whole period of time. Conditions like schizophrenia, severe depression, bipolar disorder, trauma-related illnesses, developmental disabilities, addiction, and emotional dysregulation were poorly understood and heavily feared socially. Families often felt isolated, ashamed, exhausted. And institutionalization frequently became the only available option once someone's behavior was considered too unpredictable or too difficult to manage at home. Think about it. Difficult to manage. Difficult to manage. Because once emotional suffering becomes reframed primarily as disruption, the system itself starts changing emotionally. The patient slowly risks becoming a behavioral issue, a scheduling problem, a safety concern, a burden on limited resources. Rather than a person experiencing overwhelming internal pain. That shift can happen quietly, gradually, almost invisibly. And maybe that's what makes old psychiatric institutions feel emotionally heavy, even now. Not because of paranormal stories, but because people instinctively sense the tension between care, control, compassion, and containment. All of these things existing inside the same environment simultaneously. Many early psychiatric hospitals were actually founded with optimistic intentions. Fresh air, routine, rest, structure. The belief that calm environments might help stabilize emotional distress. Some institutions were even built with beautiful architecture and landscaped grounds because people genuinely believed environment could influence mental health positively. You would think, right? But over time, as patient populations exploded and resources failed to keep pace, the emotional atmosphere shifted. Routine became rigid. Care became procedural. Human complexity became harder for systems to accommodate. And once institutions become overwhelmed enough, quietness itself starts looking therapeutic. That's one of the darkest philosophical currents running underneath this entire week. Society repeatedly confused silence with healing. A sedated patient looks calmer. A restrained patient looks safer. A compliant patient looks like they're improving. But visible quietness does not necessarily mean suffering has disappeared internally. Sometimes it simply means suffering became less disruptive externally. And that distinction should unsettle everybody, because hospitals increasingly relied on interventions designed not just to heal, but to stabilize environments operationally. Sedation, electroshock, physical restraints, isolation, rest cures, and eventually, lobotomy. All emerging from the same institutional desire to reduce chaos, to restore order, to create predictability. Again, not necessarily from cruelty, often from exhaustion, from limited understanding, from impossible patient loads, from fear. That complexity matters because simplistic villain narratives prevent people from learning anything meaningful from history. The real danger wasn't cartoon evil. The danger was systems slowly drifting toward emotional detachment while convincing themselves that they were still acting compassionately. And honestly, that's a heck of a lot more frightening. Because it means ordinary people inside ordinary institutions can slowly normalize disturbing things without fully realizing it. Especially when uncertainty becomes overwhelming. That's another reason psychiatric hospitals became emotionally strange environments. They existed at the edge of medical understanding. Doctors could observe behavior, but consciousness itself remained mysterious territory. Emotion remained mysterious territory. Trauma remained mysterious territory. And yet institutions still had to function operationally despite all that uncertainty. Meals had to be served. Wards had to be supervised. Schedules had to be maintained. Patients had to be monitored. The institution itself became a machine attempting to organize overwhelming psychological suffering into manageable structure. And machines naturally prioritize order. That's where the emotional unease enters, because human beings are not orderly creatures emotionally. Grief isn't orderly. Panic isn't orderly. Psychosis isn't orderly. Trauma isn't orderly. Depression isn't orderly. But institutions require systems. You're listening to The Midnight Drive. So all of that pressure built up from the lack of order created environments where procedures like lobotomy could start sounding reasonable. Not because people stopped caring, but because overwhelmed systems became increasingly desperate for interventions capable of restoring operational calm. That's what makes the history of psychiatric institutions so emotionally unsettling. The horror wasn't hidden beneath dramatic darkness. It lived beneath fluorescent lights. It lived inside paperwork. It lived inside routine. Inside the slow transformation of suffering into something systems tried to organize rather than truly understand. And maybe that's why abandoned psychiatric hospitals still affect people emotionally, even now. Not because the buildings are all haunted, but because the walls still seem to carry echoes of a period when medicine, authority, exhaustion, hope, fear, and human suffering all collided inside the same institutional corridors. Maybe that's why abandoned psychiatric hospitals still linger so heavily in the public's imagination. Not because people truly believe every old institution is actually haunted, but because certain environments seem capable of preserving emotional atmosphere long after the original systems disappear. Old psychiatric hospitals carry that feeling intensely. I'm going to pause for just a moment. We talked several weeks ago about the concept of stone theory, and this is getting very, very close to it. Stone tape theory is what it's called. Stone tape theory. So, quick plug, if this idea of the walls echoing all of this shared dissonant and dynamics, you might really enjoy that episode. Unpause. Old psychiatric hospitals carry that feeling intensely. Long corridors, faded paint, fluorescent fixtures still hanging overhead. Dust-covered nursing stations. Patient records left behind in forgotten filing cabinets. Wheelchairs sitting motionless in empty rooms. The buildings often feel suspended between care and containment. And maybe that contradiction is what unsettles people the most, because hospitals are supposed to represent healing, safety, compassion. But psychiatric institutions from this particular era often absorbed something heavier over time. Exhaustion, fear, helplessness, overstimulation, emotional suppression, and institutional detachment. Not intentionally, gradually. Because systems rarely become emotionally cold all at once. The shift usually happens slowly through routine. One patient becomes difficult to calm. Another one requires restraint. Another begins screaming through the night. Another stops responding entirely. Staff fatigue grows. Budgets shrink. Patient numbers rise. And eventually, human suffering risks becoming procedural. That's the kind of atmosphere people still feel lingering inside abandoned institutions. Not necessarily ghosts, just accumulated emotional weight. Because environments shaped by prolonged stress and emotional suppression often leave powerful psychological impressions behind. Again, this is getting really, really close to that idea of stone tape theory. Humans are extremely sensitive to atmospheres like this. Lighting changes mood. Sound changes perception. Architecture changes emotional response. And psychiatric hospitals from this era were often designed around order, observation, and control. Wide hallways, locked wards, minimal privacy, structured routines, institutional symmetry. The architecture itself reflected the philosophy underneath. Stability, predictability, containment. That's part of why the environments still feel emotionally uncanny now. Not because the buildings themselves are evil, but because they visibly preserve a philosophy many people instinctively recoil from today. The idea that emotional suffering could become systematized, categorized, managed institutionally. And maybe that's why modern people often describe old psychiatric hospitals as feeling heavy. Because even without paranormal beliefs, the atmosphere still communicates something emotionally unresolved. You can almost feel the tension between compassion and control, treatment and sedation, healing and quietness, lingering in the architecture itself, especially at night. Fluorescent lighting plays a strange role in this particular atmosphere as well. There's something emotionally unnatural about institutional light after midnight. The constant hum, the absence of warmth, the way hallways feel suspended outside ordinary life. Psychiatric hospitals often operated 24 hours a day in a kind of perpetual artificial stillness. Patients awake at odd hours. Nurses moving quietly through corridors. Medication schedules continuing endlessly. The institution never fully sleeping. That environment changes people psychologically over time. And maybe that's the one reason institutional burnout became so common. Caregivers themselves slowly became absorbed into the emotional machinery of the system. Compassion fatigue, emotional numbing, procedural thinking, the slow transformation of caregiving into operational management. Again, not from cruelty, from repetition, from exhaustion, from prolonged exposure to suffering without adequate understanding or resources. And maybe that's the most unsettling realization hidden inside all of this. The system often harmed both patients and caregivers simultaneously. Patients lost individuality beneath institutional routine. Staff lost emotional resilience beneath institutional pressure. Everyone slowly became shaped by the environment itself. That's what makes old psychiatric institutions feel so psychologically loaded, even decades later. They weren't simply hospitals. They became entire ecosystems built around trying to contain forms of suffering that humanity still barely understands even now. Depression, psychosis, trauma, panic, identity collapse, suicidal despair. The most overwhelming corners of human experience, all compressed into systems trying to desperately remain orderly. And once order becomes the institution's survival mechanism, quietness starts becoming dangerously seductive. That's the philosophical thread connecting nearly every episode this week. Some of the heaviest places in history were built by ordinary people trying to help, while slowly becoming trapped inside the systems that began prioritizing order over personhood.